Hey guys, it's Scott. I'm here to tutor you guys through this video, the bony structures in the head and neck. So we're going to start with the outside of the skull and then work our way in. So first thing I want to show you are the sutures, okay? So we're looking at the top of the skull right here, okay? So we'll start in the front, right? This is the anterior side of the skull, right? So anterior side, we see this suture coming across here. This is the coronal suture, right, in the coronal plane. So this is the coronal suture here, and it meets up with the sagittal suture, which is running in the sagittal plane. The meeting point of the coronal suture, right, which is, again, separating the frontal bone and the parietal bones, right, the meeting point of the coronal suture and the sagittal suture is called the bregma, okay, so that's the bregma in the front, okay. If we follow the sagittal suture down, we'll get to a branching point back here. So, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a suture going this way, obliquely, and a suture going that way, obliquely, okay. So this branching point is called the lambda, right, because the sagittal suture and these two sutures kind of make what looks like the Greek letter lambda, okay. So the lambda, right, is where the lambdoid sutures come off. So these are the lambdoid sutures, okay, separating the parietal bones from the occipital bone, okay. And then just back here, we've seen this before, this little ridge right here, right in the middle, that bump, that is the inion, also known as the external occipital protuberance. Okay. Another structure you want to be aware of, so now we're looking at the side of the skull here. So this is the squamous suture, right, separating the temporal bones from the parietal bones. You don't have to worry about that, but you do have to worry about is where the coronal suture meets the squamous suture, along with some other sutures up here that you don't have to know of. But this meeting point right here, basically where this little nail is, that's called the pterion, okay? The pterion is important, has a clinical significance, because right underneath is where the middle meningeal artery lies. So if you get a blow to the head right at the pterion, right, you can expect to get an epidural hematoma when the middle meningeal artery ruptures. Okay, coming along to the front of the skull, I want to point out a couple of little foramen here. So right here, you can see it just above the orbit, right? That's the supraorbital foramen. And then in the same vertical line, right underneath the orbit, you can see it right here, that's the infraorbital foramen. And then if I pull my mandible up over here, okay, you can see a little hole right there. That's the mental foramen, okay? On the topic of the mandible, let me just show you something that's important here. So right over here, if you look on the inside of the mandible, you're going to see a little, right underneath this spring over here, it's a little hole. I don't know if you can see it. See if I get a better view here. So right here, you see it now? There you go. So that right there is the mandibular foramen. So that is where our inferior alveolar artery vein nerve pass through to get to the mandible, and eventually one of those, the inferior alveolar nerve will pass through here as the mental nerve, right? That's all you have to know for the mandible, so I'm going to put it aside now. All right, we're going to come back to the orbit view from the outside, but I want to show you it from the inside first. So I'm going to open up the skull. Okay, so let's look at the inside of our skull here. So our internal view, so obviously a couple of big structures that stand out, okay? So here is our foramen magnum, right? That's where our spinal cord passes through and comes up and enters the brainstem and whatnot. I want to point out to you some of the things right here. So this little gap right here, we kind of talked about it if you're at my tutoring session, but this little kind of indentation, that's the sella turcica, right? That's where the pituitary gland sits. All right, so the sella turcica right there. Now, right above the sella turcica is the above the pituitary gland, sitting in the sella turcica, is the optic chiasm. Right, so that's where the two optic nerves meet and then split off as the optic tracts. Right, so the tumor in the pituitary that rises up and hits the optic chiasm can cause a bitemporal hemianopsia, which we talked about in tutoring. But that being said, the optic nerve is going to be right above the sella turcica. So, that being said, this hole right here that the end of my pen is in, that's the optic canal. Okay, the optic canal. All right, so the optic canal goes right there. And these little processes here, this little guy on this side and this little guy this side, so these are clinoid processes. Specifically, these are the anterior clinoid processes. The posterior ones would be right here and right here, but they're kind of been sheared off a little bit. So these two right here are clinoid processes, right? They're on our sphenoid bone, okay? All right. Now, moving to this view, kind of little low-hanging view. So you see this hole right here? I'm kind of see if I can get a view. This hole right here, this long one, right? That's the superior orbital fissure, right? The superior orbital fissure. Not the supraorbital, but the superior orbital fissure. Okay, through that passes the ophthalmic division of 5, so V1, if you will, and also passes cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6, right? Because these are going to the orbit, right? Which has not been, you know, it hasn't been carved out over here with the orbit underneath there. Okay, so the superior orbital fissure. Okay, now just posterior to the superior orbital fissure is this hole right here. You can see it's kind of got some pen marks on it right there. That is the foramen rotundum. Through the foramen rotundum goes the maxillary division of 5, V2, if you will. When V2 passes through the foramen rotundum, right, I'm going to show you to the inferior side, it's going to then pass, so I can't really show it, I can't really show it to you, but it's going to then pass through what we call the infraorbital canal, so through foramen rotundum, goes through the infraorbital canal, again, very hard to see here, and then emerges in the orbit through the inferior orbital fissure right there. So you can see the superior orbital fissure right here, nice and bright. This one right here, so we can get you right there, is the inferior orbital fissure. So in case he shows it to you in the view of the orbit, this is the superior and this is the inferior orbital fissure. Okay, and the inferior orbital fissure is going to pass the branches of the maxillary nerve, right, like the infraorbital nerve and the zygomatic nerve, along with some little arteries and veins that we don't care too much about. All right, so that's that was the infraorbital canal through from the foramen rotundum right here, the infraorbital canal to the inferior orbital fissure. Okay, moving on, we have this structure right here. Right there. So right, that was our foramen rotundum. This big one right here is the foramen ovale. That's going to pass our mandibular division of 5V1. Okay, so the foramen ovale, the foramen rotundum, the supraorbital fissure, right? V3, V2, V1. Okay, now right next to, lateral to the foramen ovale, is this little guy right here. That's the foramen spinosum, which passes our middle meningeal artery. It's how our middle meningeal artery gets into the skull, as opposed to all these other things, which things are going out of the skull. Okay? Now, don't get the foramen ovale confused with this thing. So this hole right here, right? That is the foramen lacerum. Nothing is actually passing through the foramen lacerum. Through the foramen lacerum is where we actually see the internal carotid artery. So the internal carotid artery is going to enter through the carotid canal, I should say, and it's going to kind of pass here and then pop up through this hole right here, whoop, like that towards you. Okay, so this is actually the foramen lacerum through which we see the carotid artery, the internal carotid artery in the carotid canal. Now we can see the carotid canal from the inferior view as well. So this right here, right there, that's our carotid canal. I know this all looks like junk right now, but I'm going to make it clear, a little more clear a little later on. So this is our carotid canal. Okay, this was our foramen ovale, right there. That was our middle meningeal, our foramen spinosum, carotid canal. Okay, and I'll turn this over when we see some more stuff. Okay, so next structure. The next structure I want you to be aware of is the jugular foramen. Okay, so in your bodies, it's hard to see your jugular foramen because we basically cut the head, we separated the head through the jugular foramen. But right here, that's the jugular foramen, right there. So you have your petrous ridge, which you're not responsible for here, and then the jugular foramen. Okay, so don't get it confused with this thing right here, right? this hole, that's the internal auditory meatus, going through this ridge, the petrous ridge. This one, right between the internal auditory meatus and the foramen magnum, this one right here, that's the jugular foramen. Jugular foramen passes the internal jugular vein along with cranial nerves 9, 10, and 11. Okay, we can see the foramen, the jugular foramen, on the other side as well. Ooh, so it moves through just like that. So right here, my pen is, that's the jugular foramen. Don't get it confused with this guy that's right above it. That's the carotid canal. Okay, so carotid canal right here, that one. Jugular foramen right here. Okay, carotid canal, ooh, jugular foramen. I apologize, I'm trying to do this without actually looking at the camera, but it's hard. Or without looking at the bone, but it's hard. So carotid canal, jugular foramen. Okay, let's take a brief moment to look at our temporal bone here. I forgot to show you this one. So this is our temporal bone, right? And this big guy right back here, right, that's the mastoid process. And this is the external auditory meatus. Okay? External auditory meatus, mastoid process. Now right here was cut off. You can kind of see a little bit of the stump, but this thing right here, this thing right here, that is the, or was, the styloid process, which means the little hole right next to it, getting close here, that little hole right there, that's the stylomastoid foramen right there. Okay, passes the facial nerve. Okay, couple of last minute things here. Look at the underside of our skull here. We see these two ridges, so one on both sides, but also they separate here. One here and one here. My pen is between them. These are the pterygoid plates, the medial and lateral pterygoid plates. The end of the medial pterygoid plate is the pterygoid hamulus. Kind of been cut off here a little bit, but this would be the pterygoid hamulus. Okay, right there. Okay. Okay, last couple of things before we move on that I forgot to mention. So, foramen magnum, right? Right next to the foramen magnum, there's going to be a little, oh, it's going to be really tiny. There's a little hole right there. Right there. That's the hypoglossal canal. You can see it from there, and you can also see it from here, right? Both sides. You can see the hypoglossal canal. That's obviously where the hypoglossal nerve comes through. Another thing I wanted to show you, again, I'm not sure how he's going to tag these, if he even is, but I figured I'd show you just in case. So the sinuses. Okay, we talked about the sinuses a little bit, but right here where all these foramen are, right next to the sella turcica, right in here is going to be the cavernous sinus, right? Because the cavernous sinus is going to pass 3, 4, 5, 1, 5, 2, and 6. So right here, north of the foraminal valley and next to the sella turcica in here, that's going to be the cavernous sinus. Okay, now you can't obviously see the sinuses themselves on the bones, but you can see the indentations. I'm going to see if I can show them to you. So right here there's an indentation. I don't know if you can appreciate it. There's an indentation right here. That's where the transverse sinus sits. So the transverse sinus goes around the side of the skull. And then right over here, let me get a better view here. Right over here is an indentation. So again, we're looking at the posterior surface of the skull. So there's an indentation right here that meets up with this indentation here. This right here is the superior sagittal sinus. It's going to meet up right about at the inion, right? It's going to meet up at the what we call the confluence, okay, along with the occipital sinus, which we're not going to worry about. The last sinus that is on your list, okay, is a sinus. This one's a little more obvious the way it moves, but there's a little kind of squiggly, path here, like that. That's the sigmoid sinus, right? That's the sigmoid sinus. And all of these are coming through to meet up at the jugular foramen. Okay? Okay, so now we're going to move on to the structures that were quote-unquote parlayed until this practical, which is basically cervical vertebrae. So we'll start with our typical cervical vertebrae, right? So this is a typical cervical vertebrae, okay, vertebra. This right here, it's obviously the vertebral body, okay? This right here, the big hole in the middle, that's your vertebral foramen, which passes the spinal cord. And then these things right here, this one on this side and this one on this side, those are the transverse processes, okay? And specifically in cervical vertebrae, the transverse processes has an anterior tubercle and a posterior tubercle, anterior, posterior, and a foramen. These are the transverse foramina, right, which pass the vertebral arteries. Okay, now back here we have our lamina, so lamina, right? We have pedicles, right? Pedicles are right here, so this is one pedicle, right there, and right here, right? These are the pedicles. This right here is your bifid spinous process. You can see it has two little heads here. Okay, not all cervical vertebrae have two heads in their spinous process, but this one does. If this was C7, this would be also vertebra prominens, right? And then if I turn the vertebra like this, you can see that let's see if I can, yeah, you can see the vertebral body has like these curved edges. So you see how the vertebral body kind of curves up on both sides, right? Curves up. These are called the uncinate processes, right? Form the oncovertebral joints. So these little curved edges right here, those are the uncinate processes, okay? And just a quick note about the typical vertebrae, right? Specifically C6, you'll see it on your sheet, the carotid tubercle. So the carotid tubercle, based on what I've read, is really just the anterior tubercle of the transverse process on C6, right? So this tubercle right here will be the carotid tubercle if you're looking at C6, because that's where the carotid artery really starts to pass up in the neck. So I guess that's what they're going for, but that's all I got. Okay. Okay, so now we have our atlas, okay? Our atlas, right, this is the superior view of our atlas, C1, right? Superior view. This right here, these right here are our facets for the occipital condyles, how the occiput sits on the atlas. Okay, this is the anterior, this up here is the anterior side of the atlas, and this is the posterior side. So this bump right here, that's our anterior tubercle, which is part of our anterior arch. And this is our posterior tubercle over here on our posterior arch. These are the transverse processes with our transverse foramina here, okay, on both sides. The vertebral arteries pass through them, and then the vertebral arteries pass around here and cross this, what they call the groove for the vertebral arteries. Groove vertebral arteries are right under the condyles, right here on both sides, right here and right here. Kind of hard to appreciate. And that's pretty much it. And then I don't think it's on your list, but right here behind the anterior tubercle, right, that's where the facet for the dens, where the dens articulates. So that's pretty much that for the atlas. All right, and last but not least, we have the C2, or the axis, right? So the C2, the axis, has obviously one structure that is particularly different than the rest, and that's the dens, right? So the dens is this phallic structure up top. That's really all that's interesting about the axis. I mean, it has a spinous process. It's bifid in this case, right? It has transverse processes, vertebral foramen. That's really all that's interesting about the axis, okay? So that's really all you need to know. And with that, that is the bony structures of the practical exam. Thanks, guys.